welcome everybody. I'm Gabriel Zucman. I'm one of the co-organizers of Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, along with Suresh Naidu and Daniel Roderick. And we're very excited to have this panel today on such an important question, the future of macroeconomics. I'm going to briefly introduce the panel. So we have Gillian Brunet, assistant professor at Wesleyan University and working at the intersection of economic history, macro and public economics. Then we'll have a presentation by Wendy Carlin, professor of economics at UCL and leader of the core project that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that produces an open access ebook that's used by universities around the world. We'll have Josh Mason, associate professor at John Jay College, CUNY, where there is a new master program in heterodox economics, and they're still accepting applications. We'll have Jón Steinsson, professor of economics here at UC Berkeley, who's working on a very exciting new undergraduate textbook. And our panel is going to be moderated by Jón Stiglitz, who needs no introduction, Nobel laureate, professor of economics at Columbia. So Joe, why don't you say a few words and then we'll start with the presentation.
Well, thank you very much for organizing. And I think this is really very, very timely and very interesting subject. It is remarkable. The various panelists prepared a little papers for this, and as one read these papers, one got the sense of a broad set of dissatisfaction with the state of macroeconomics, some people being more optimistic than a lot of ribbing that some leading macroeconomists shortly before the 2008 crisis described macroeconomics as being in great shape. There's a famous quote from Bob Lucas before the 2008 crisis saying, problem of macroeconomic fluctuations has solved. Obviously, that was not true. The nature of the dissatisfaction, though, is very varied. There are satisfaction from perspective of policymakers. My role as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and as my advisor, World Bank and so forth, the models that academic economists have developed are actually of limited use for policymakers. They're a very limited for the short run analysis, talking about what we should do in the next year for an economic downturn, for downturns, how we go about restructuring the financial system. They were of almost no use for that purpose. In terms of dealing with the pandemic, they've been of relatively limited of any use. So that's the short run. We all know that there are lots of problems of structural transformation, the medium term. How do we go from a manufacturing-based economy to a service sector, knowledge-based, green economy, big macroeconomic transformation with very strong consequences for inequality, not very helpful for that. Long-term economic growth with the good models incorporate things like human capital and endogeneity of technology. They give us any insights that we didn't have from simpler formulations. Concerned that they don't address the key issues today of crises, inequality, climate. So that's from the side of policymakers. Very interesting that when I talk to people who are in econometrics, they're dissatisfied with the econometric, statistical basis. Calibration is not a statistical approach that's very pervasive. But when I talk, I come from this theory point of view, and I find the models theoretically dissatisfying, that you have an enormous amount of apparatus to tell you things like fractions of the population are credit constrained, and that should have been obvious. And we've had empirical research going back many decades on that. So these are all some of the dissatisfactions, and I hope that the panelists will give insights on why we've wound up in that state, and most importantly, where do we go from here? What is the agenda for the future? So let's begin. And I think the agreement was that was going to begin first. Is that right?
Hi, everyone. So I think there's really, I don't want to be overly prescriptive, because I think we really benefit as a field from diversity of thought, from diversity of approaches, and people taking kind of a wide variety of approaches. And, you know, I think modeling is really important. I don't want anyone to think that I'm anti-theory. I think that the field is somewhat unbalanced at the moment, and I'll get to that. But there's really just two very simple underlying things that I think we need to demand of research in macro if we want the field to keep moving in a positive direction. And I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle of the group of panelists in terms of being perhaps less optimistic than some and more optimistic than others. So I think the first of these two requirements is that things need to be testable, and not just testable, they need to be tested, right? Matching moments is not enough. I think it's a source of great confusion to economists outside of macro, and actually really inhibits communication between macro and other fields of econ. When people talk about model calibration and matching moments as empirical work, that's not empirical work as any microeconomist understands it. And I think, you know, we should get rid of that. It took a long time when I was in graduate school for me to figure out that if I told people I did empirical macro, they had completely the wrong idea of what I did, that I needed to say I do micro methods for macro questions, and then people understood what I actually did. And I think, you know, that's just a big confusion that needs to be cleared up. And I think, you know, modeling is really helpful. We don't have empirics without theory, right? You cannot interpret data without having a theory, a clear theory to use to understand what's going on in the data. But we need to actually hold models to testing, right? We need to say, you know, falsifiable testing, where a model can fail and we can say this model doesn't work. You know, we need to do something else. This doesn't match the reality, and you need to rule models out, right? That's what it means to be a social science. I think the other thing is that I think the field would do a lot better and would grow. And I'm not saying no one is doing this. I think many of the best macroeconomists these days are doing this. So we need to really think as a field very carefully about how the underlying assumptions in our models restrict the set of questions that can be answered with a given model. So over the last 40 or so years, a lot of short-run macro has focused on the idea of building, you know, a single, unified, internally consistent model of the economy, right? Starting with RBC models and then moving into new Keynesian models, et cetera. And I don't think that's a bad use of time. I think there's really obvious advantages and really obvious reasons why that's a worthy goal and why people do focus on that. But I think there are some risks to focusing on that too much. And specifically, it's that I think it disrupts the close association between the model and the question you're using it to answer, right? We're taught in graduate school that every model is wrong because every model is a simplification. The important question is this model wrong in a way that affects what I'm trying to use it for? That there's this very tight relationship between model and question. And when we try to use one model for everything and say, this is the model, yeah, and with this bell and whistle, what happens is that people end up focusing on how the bells and whistles match the question, but don't think about the relationship between the question and the underlying model. And so I think rather than saying a lot of modern macro models are bad, I'm going to say a lot of modern macro models are used overly broadly in terms of being used for a much broader set of questions than they're really designed to answer when we think about the assumptions that are built in. That said, I think there is a lot to be hopeful about in the field. You know, if we think about the last decade or so, there's been a real explosion of theoretical work, of empirical work. And I think one way to say this is that really empirical work and theoretical work are complements, right? And that basically what we've done is we're at a really non-optimal point in terms of the balance between the two, that we have way too much theory relative to empirics in the field. And so theory isn't being disciplined adequately by empirics, and we're ending up with worse theory as a result. So I think my argument is actually we'd end up with better and more useful theory with more focus on empirics. And I think a lot of the people who are doing really the best theoretical contributions to macro right now are people who do both theoretical and empirical work. And, we need to see more of that. We need to see, more Johns and more Yuri Gornichenkos and more, all of these people who really go back and forth between the empirics and the theory and build in that direction. I think there are some really nice things. Macro finance has done beautiful things in the last decade, that the integration of financial sector into our understanding of the macroeconomy in the wake of the Great Recession has been just great. There's an immense amount of empirical work. I think macro finance and macro labor are the areas where we've really seen that take off the most, that people have kind of figured out how to do this in really useful ways. We've seen more realistic modeling of households. I tend to think that households on average, or in general, are less sophisticated than at least larger dominant firms. And so the way a typical macro model models households is more problematic than the way it models firms. And so I think really changing our assumptions about households, and I think that we've seen that. We've seen introductions of heterogeneity, of liquidity constraints, of limits on information or attention or foresight, and that have really, opened up some beautiful, really thought-provoking work that's really moving the field in a good direction. I think generally, when we think about why have those things been so successful, they're incorporating insights from behavioral economics into macro, which I think is really important. They're focusing on mechanisms, which I think has been a very good trend in economics as a whole in the last decade or two. And they're using microdata to think about micro mechanisms, right, to really drive into this. So briefly, I think it's worth getting into how did macro get so theory dominated in the first place? And I actually think we should acknowledge that part of it is that good empirical work is hard to do, right? That especially in macro, you have problems that you don't have in micro, in that, say, major macro events are quite rare. We don't have a particularly large sample of recessions or financial crises, other major macro events. With globalization, they're increasingly correlated across countries. There's all these problems that make it difficult to work on them empirically. Using microdata to really focus in on a single event, I think, has been huge, and that's driven a lot of macro in the last decade, right? If we think about all the really good empirical studies of the Great Recession, specific aspects of the Great Recession and the 2008 crisis, those have been immensely helpful. But I actually think that you still end up with problems there, right? Because you might do, say, a great study of one of the mechanisms for unconventional monetary policy of, say, okay, how do inflation expectations affect consumption at the zero lower bound in the Great Recession? And you might do a great job estimating that, but you can't separate that from what's the institutional setting of the Great Recession. And that's where I think economic history has a lot to offer macroeconomics, because you can extend the sample backwards. You can think about other settings it's really amazing, especially the first half of the 20th century, which is, there isn't modern data collection, but they collected an immense amount of information that, frankly, they had no ability to analyze at the time. But there's kind of a digitization revolution in history going on where one can now do that, and one can now do the kind of macro or micro data studies of historical events. And then you can look at, say, how I have a paper where I'm with Carola Binder, where we look at how do inflation expectations affect consumption during the Korean War, where you don't have debt constrained households. The median debt to income ratio is 2% in our sample. Dramatically different environment than the Great Recession. And so that tells us a lot about how do these institutional factors affect the parameters. And I think, all of this can be used, this careful empirical work, looking at different settings, different situations, can tell us something really useful to discipline our theory. And I think that would revitalize the field a lot if there was kind of more of a feedback loop from empirics back to theory to help move theory forward.
Thank you very much, Gillian. And Wendy, and I hope we can try to keep within the time frame because we want to have some discussion at the end. Wendy?
Yep, let's go. So where I want to begin is that what many would see as the current healthy state of microeconomics has been driven over the last 40 years by two complementary developments: advances in economic theory and the what people call the credibility revolution in empirical research. But around the time that micro theory was embracing the behavioral and information economics revolutions, so they were dropping assumptions of complete information, universally far-sighted actors, clearing markets. Just at that time, macro theory turned in the opposite direction, going off on a detour. It became wedded to a model world rooted in intertemporal optimization and perfect foresight for all the different agent types. So obviously, for a limited set of problems and in particularly skilled hands, this Walrasian turn in macro produced new and useful knowledge. And we should note that the key insight of the Lucas critique is nothing other than imposing the discipline of Nash equilibrium reasoning on macro, which is essential for sound policy advice. Gillian highlighted the weaknesses in empirical research in macro that have accompanied the dominant macro research paradigm. She suggested some progress is being made, and I think John's going to return to that. But the lag behind policy relevant micro, as Joe suggested at the beginning, really remains palpable. And this may partly account for the even worse underrepresentation of women in macro than in other fields. So I want to use up my remaining minutes to suggest that there is a coherent, new, different benchmark in economics that unifies micro and macro. So the point is not to modify, not adding bells and whistles to the existing baseline model in macro, but to replace it. And unsurprisingly, the new benchmark model is built on non-Walrasian foundations of the information and behavioral revolutions. And I'm just going to pick up three crucial foundations relating to human behavior and information, the second one, technology, and the third, dynamics. So just to take the first, if we think of a world where information is necessarily limited, then it means that contracts are incomplete. This has three implications for macro arising from the principal agent relationships in the key labor and credit markets. Markets don't clear, so there's no supply-demand intersection. Second, private power within firms and social norms are essential to economic interactions and allocations. And third, endowments matter. So let's be specific. The labor market doesn't clear, there's involuntary unemployment in equilibrium. The employer has the power to set the wage that's constrained by the rent that has to be paid to the worker to elicit adequate effort. And social norms affect the wage that's set. The credit market, another crucial market for macro, doesn't clear. There are always credit-constrained households, and the wealth of the borrower affects the degree of credit rationing. So in this new benchmark macro, it matters, it really does matter whether you're an employer or a worker. whether you're a lender or a borrower. Agents, or, I actually prefer to think of them as actors, they are heterogeneous. And heterogeneous endowments, and therefore inequality, is not some sort of optional extra, but it's intrinsic to the principal-agent relationships at the heart of the macro model. You don't bring them on in an ad hoc way as, for example, hand-to-mouth households. To technology, then technology is either constant or increasing returns. So that rules out price-taking markets. And in a closed economy, firms' power vis-a-vis their customers is what's going to determine the factor distribution of income. So, and worker power affects unemployment. The market size effects that come with this kind of technology are essential to innovation. So that's the second one. The third one, dynamics. In the new benchmark, then the economy isn't self-stabilizing around a unique equilibrium. And what we see is actually, even in macro, that when the problems are really too pressing to ignore, research does respond. And a key case in point is the flourishing of research in macro finance that Gillian referred to in the wake of the financial crisis. And that demonstrated that positive feedback processes, not consistent with a stabilization around a unique equilibrium, that positive feedback processes in housing and in leverage-based financial markets can produce a dangerous financial cycle that doesn't necessarily disrupt successful inflation targeting. So the great moderation calm hid the building financial crisis storm. And the new research, that kind of burst of new research generated by the new problems has fed directly into policy at the global level. And if you want to see how it has, then have a look at the new core insight called Too Big to Fail, which was published yesterday. So my final point is that the new benchmark also unifies short, medium, and long-run macro. So in the new benchmark, purposeful actors seek returns, placing rent-seeking entrepreneurs at the heart of innovation and therefore growth. So the social benefits of creative destruction depend not only on those prospective innovation rents, but also on them being destroyed by competition from imitators. And then, the new step has to be taken on the quality ladder to get the next round of Schumpeterian rents. Like macro finance, Schumpeterian growth theory has brought a powerful theoretical framework together with rigorous empirical work using new data sets. And this really underscores, I think, the possibilities for this unifying framework that I've sketched. And in the growth context, again, we have micro and macro economists working together on theory and data to answer important policy problems. The divisions are breaking down, and you just have to look at the multi-author teams that we now observe. So the future is bright for a new macroeconomics. We have sound foundations for a new coherent benchmark model. It's one that we can teach undergraduates. It connects them to the newly emerging research frontier, and it's capable of addressing the most pressing problems, the ones that Joe outlined at the start. So
well, thank you very much, Wendy. Josh?
I think we owe it to ourselves to be brutally honest about the state of macroeconomics. What is taught in today's graduate programs as macroeconomics is entirely useless for the kinds of questions we are interested in. I have in front of me the macro comp from this year from a well-regarded mainstream economics PhD program. It starts with the familiar Euler equation with a representative agent maximizing their utility from consumption over an infinite future. And then we introduce various complications. We can have a final or an intermediate good, multiple goods, firms can have markup power, we can introduce random variation in the production technology. And at each stage of this process, the question is, what is the optimal path chosen by the representative household under the new set of constraints? That is the only kind of thinking that the comp requires a person to do. That is what macroeconomics education looks like in 2021, just as much as it did 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I suppose. And I would argue that that kind of training provides no preparation whatsoever for thinking about the substantive questions that we are interested in. It's not that this or that assumption is unrealistic. It is that there is no point of contact between the world of these models and the real economies that we live in. I don't think anybody here in this conversation or anybody thinking about these questions in the wider world actually reasons this way when they're thinking about real economic issues. If you ask somebody, and I would say including somebody who teaches this type of material in the classroom, how serious inflation is likely to be next year, or how much of a constraint public debt is on public spending, or how income distribution might change based on labor market conditions, they will not base their answer on some kind of vaguely analogous question about a world of rational households optimizing the trade-off between labor and consumption over an infinite future. And they won't base their answer on a world of somewhat less than rational households optimizing over a somewhat less than infinite future. They will instead answer it based on concrete institutional historical knowledge of the world we live in today. Now, of course, once you've come up with a good plausible answer to your question, you can always go back and construct a microfounded model that supports it. But at the end of the day, what have you got? With some ingenuity, you can get a Keynesian multiplier out of a properly microfounded multiplier. But in terms of what you know about the world, you don't learn anything that you didn't already know from having the multiplier idea in your head to begin with. So my personal view is we really do need to roll back the clock at least 40 years and throw out the macroeconomics curriculum as it exists in graduate programs today. Obviously, that's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think that is the goal that we should be aiming for if we want a macroeconomics that can contribute meaningfully to public debates. So then the big question, of course, is what do we put in its place? Now, I want to be very clear. There is not a well-developed established body of heterodox theory that is ready to go in place of the established curriculum. We're going to have to build up something new, but we're not starting from scratch. We can find promising elements from macroeconomics work from previous generations, from work in the margins of the profession, work being done by people outside of economics, either in the policy world, the business world, or in other social sciences. And this work, this sort of basis for what I would see as a more scientific macroeconomics, it seems to me has several characteristics. First, it develops in close contact with broader public debates. Macroeconomics does not exist to study the economy in the abstract. There's no such thing. It exists to help us answer concrete questions about the situations that we find ourselves in the present, or concrete historical questions about the past. The questions of what topics are important, what assumptions are reasonable, what considerations are relevant, these are the sorts of questions that cannot be answered within a body of theory itself. They can only be answered from the perspective outside the theory in terms of what the theory is going to be used for or applied to. So macroeconomic theory, if we want it to be something that we can use, cannot be an axiomatic system developed from first principles. Better first principles are not the answer. The answer is to start with the conversations that exist among policymakers, business people, journalists, and so on, and then generalize and systematize them. A corollary of that is that our goal should not be one model of the economy. It should be a bunch of little models designed to answer a bunch of different questions. Second, I think a more scientific macroeconomics will have national accounting at its center. Physical scientists spend an enormous amount of time refining and mastering their data collection tools and techniques. For macroeconomics, our primary form of data is the national accounts. We have other data that also should be a central part of the curriculum. That should be a major part of graduate education in macroeconomics, should be getting a deep understanding of existing accounting and data collection practices. If models are going to be relevant for policy or empirical work, they need to be built around the categories of macroeconomic data. Third, macroeconomics is fundamentally about aggregates. The questions that macroeconomics asks involve economy-wide variables like output, inflation, the wage share, the trade balance, and so on. No matter how these relationships are derived, the operational content of the theory is a set of causal relationships between these aggregate variables. Now, you absolutely can and should shed light on those relationships by using microdata, but the questions themselves really need to be posed in terms of observable aggregates. Fourth, a more scientific macroeconomics needs to be historical. There are few, if any, general laws for how an economy operates. The best we can do is identify patterns that are more or less consistent over some span of time and space. Macroeconomics also needs to be historical in a second sense, which is that we are always talking about developments that unfold in historical time, where one thing happens and then another. This, among other reasons, is why I think an intertemporal approach is just fundamentally misguided. In general, we need fewer models of the business cycle, and we need a lot more narrative descriptions of individual cycles. we need a sort of figure ground reversal in how we think about our field. That instead of approaching concrete developments or particular cases as sort of testing grounds for our theory, we need to think of our theory as being embedded in a larger, not formalized historical or narrative account of what's going on in the world. Finally, I think we need our macroeconomics to be monetary. The economies we live in are organized around flows of money payments and money commitments, and most of the variables that we're interested in are defined and measured in terms of money. These facts are not incidental. They cannot generally be set aside. The model of a hypothetical non-monetary economy is not going to generate reliable intuitions about the economies that we live in. And in particular, I would like it if we could get out of the habit of referring to inflation adjustment variables as real, as if they were some physical quantity out there behind the monetary one. So how likely is it that macroeconomics will move in this direction? Well, I'm moderately optimistic for 3 reasons. First, academic macroeconomics has lost a lot of its hold on public debates. I speak fairly often with policymakers and journalists, and in my experience, there is much less deference to mainstream economic thought in those circles than there once was. There is much more interest in alternative approaches and much less patience for strong deductive claims about the relationships between employment, inflation, wage growth, and so on. So I think, Keynes, I would say, somebody I have learned an enormous amount from and got a great deal right, but I think one thing he got wrong was saying that practical men are slaves to some defunct economist. I think the relationship is much more often the other way around, and as practical people come to think about the economy in new ways, I think the economics profession will eventually follow. The second reason I'm moderately optimistic, as mentioned by a couple of other people here, is that there's a lot of interesting empirical work going on in mainstream macroeconomics, addressing a lot of really interesting and important questions. And I think, over time, the sort of empirical side of macroeconomics could be a new center of gravity that could sort of diminish the hold of kind of the orthodox theory on the larger field. My third reason for optimism, I think, is that once people realize that you don't have to do this kind of theory, once people realize you don't actually need micro foundations, you don't need optimization in every formal description of an economic process, I think people are going to find that profoundly liberating. I think people are going to realize at some point, if you're wondering about the effect of corporate taxation on productivity growth, you don't need to model the labor supply decision of the representative household as some kind of optimization problem. You can just not do that. And you can tell the story you want to tell with some kind of simple aggregate relationship. I think a lot of what people see as essential in theory right now is really just a sort of sociological convention within the discipline. Now, those professional norms are strong. People know you can't publish unless you write this sort of paper, but they're also brittle because the only reason people do this is because they expect other people to do it. They think they have to do it. So I think once that dam breaks, it could break fast. And I think we could really see a real opening up of the field to a much more interesting and broader range of ways of thinking at a more formal level about economic processes. I hope that once people stop chasing after the will-o-wisp of general equilibrium of this one benchmark model for the economy, then we can focus more on developing a toolkit of models addressed to particular questions. I hope we'll see a more modest but a more useful body of theory that's oriented more towards concrete questions that motivate public debates, that embeds its formal models in a historical narrative that starts from the economy as we observe it, rather than a set of abstract first principles, that gets rid of utility and other unobservable variables and parameters, and that is ready to learn from historians and other social scientists.
Thank you very much, Josh. And I'm glad for your optimism. We'll see. Jón?
So there's definitely a narrative in our field that, and that's reflected in some of the comments today, that macro has lost its way, and I guess I think that is actually a better description of the state of our field some time ago than it is the state of our field today. I think it is possible that macro did lose its way, but I think now it's actually regaining its footing. The most important problem with macro over the last 40 years, in my view, is that it's been too theoretical. And that's not to say that theory is useless or anything like that. Theory is an essential part of a healthy science, but a healthy science needs balance between theory and empirical work. And I think macro lost that balance in the 1980s, but is currently regaining that balance. Now, most narratives about the evolution of macroeconomics focuses on the evolution of macroeconomic theory, and typically the rational expectations revolution plays a really central role in these narratives. Now, one of the less appreciated parts of that story, in my view, is the fact that the rational expectations revolution led to a shift away from empirical work in macroeconomics. There was a widespread confusion that arose. You know, I don't exactly know why it happened, because it's very weird that this would happen, that quasi-experimental methods were not applicable in macro. It seems that a large part of the field came to believe that the Lucas critique implied that quasi-experimental methods were not possible in macro. But, and I'd like to stress this a lot, this is not at all what the Lucas critique implies. Now, I think this belief and a huge amount of muddled and confused thinking about this issue, and you know, and I include myself as being a person that was muddled and confused about this for a long time, this held back progress in empirical macro for a generation. And I think that was a major problem, and in my view, the major problem that the macro faced over these last 40 years. Now, given the fact that during this time, since empirical macro had all these problems, theory was so dominant, I think macroeconomics was particularly exposed to what I think of as the most important methodological problem in theoretical in theoretical economics in general. And that is the simple fact that models in which markets work well are usually easier to solve than models in which markets work poorly. And since they're easier to solve, you know, people tend to use them as a baseline assumption. So even in a paper, a theoretical paper, where the focus of the analysis is some kind of friction, you know, all the other markets in the model are assumed to be perfectly competitive. So this fact that models where markets work well are simple to solve, it imparts a bias on theoretical economics and reasoning of economists in general towards models and ways of thinking about things that reflect markets working well. So I think this is a big problem, and maybe it was more evident in macro than in some other parts of economics, because macro was so theory dominant for the last 40 years. Now, let me just to drive home this point and drive home some of the other points that I've been making. I'd like to actually use an example from labor economics. Okay, so labor economics, and in particular, the issue of raising the minimum wage. Okay, so this is, in my view, a major win for kind of left-wing economics, the evolution of thinking about the minimum wage. Now, you know, some decades ago, there were lots of people that modeled things as a labor market as being perfectly competitive and had never thought of the labor market in any other way, and would say things like, theory implies that raising the minimum wage reduces employment. And then there, of course, were some other people that realized that that's not the case. It's not that theory implies that, it's a particular model that implies that. And they were maybe trying to explain that to the other people, but there was an impasse. Some people believed in this model, other people believed in another model, and people argued and argued. And I think they could argue until the end of time without any progress, unless empirical evidence came into the picture. And so why did that field make a huge amount of progress? It's not because one set of theorists convinced another set of theorists. It's because of Card and Kruger. And it's because of the literature that emanates from Card and Kruger. And so I think the same is true of macro, that the way forward is never going to be that the, you know, quote unquote heterodox theorists are going to convince the conventional theorists. The way forward is going to be, we need more empirical work that is going to discipline the theory and move the theorists in the direction of where the world really is. And that's why I'm optimistic about what's going on in macro, because I think that's what's happening. The cross equation restriction fog is lifting from the field, and people are starting to realize that quasi-experimental empirical work is possible in macro, and we're starting to build a set of facts within macro that is starting to really affect the way that theorists in macro, the focus of their work, because they're starting to be constrained by some increasingly credible facts about how the economy works. And I think that's the only way forward. And I think that's why the field is actually making a lot of progress. And I'm very optimistic about what's going on right now, because now, even though the stock of such knowledge in macro is low because we lost 40 years in our fog, I think the flow is quite substantial. And so I'm optimistic that going forward, things are going to be better in this regard. Let me just, before I finish, to respond to one of the things that Josh was saying, I agree with him that the state of PhD teaching in macro is not so great. But at one point, I agreed with a lot of things he said, but at one point he said we need to replace the current theory with some other theory. That's not my view. What we need to do in macroeconomic training is increase the role of empirical training. Macroeconomists are not trained to do empirical work. They have to go to some other class. They have to take a labor class to learn how to do empirical work. That needs to change. And that's actually the main way in which I think we need to change how macroeconomists are trained.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by maybe, I think you've given a broad and very good critique of where we are and some alternative approaches forward. Just to help focus the discussion, let me try to ask all the members of the panel to respond to a question about why macroeconomics has gotten into the sorry state that it is, or was, to take John's view about it, that there's been a lot of progress in the last 10 years, and I think that there has been. I'm not sure it's so much the Lucas critique, and I'm quite sure it's not the imbalance between theory and empirics. There was a lot of evidence and good theory about credit rationing. The obvious fact that there was unemployment should have said, you don't have to do econometrics to say that we've had unemployment problems, and that a model of macroeconomics that assumes that there's no unemployment is not a good theoretical model. This is not a question of fine-grained econometrics. It's just opening up your eyes. So it's not the econometric problem. It's, I would say, the ideological problem that would happen with the rational expectations revolution was a deliberate attempt to try to destroy Keynesian economics, the central precept of which was government intervention made a difference. And it was an attempt to say, we don't need government. Even if we did need government, it's going to be counterproductive. It's not going to be effective. And so it was a theory that was developed with an objective to give particular answers, and that there were alternative theories around that focused on credit rationing, that focused on equity rationing, all the things that Wendy talked about. All those microeconomic facts were there, that the individuals, you didn't need a Hank model to discover that a large fraction of Americans, or any country, are credit constrained. And to speak to the issue about equilibrium, if you look around the world, don't just limit it to the United States, there have been over 100 crises in the last 40 years. So there's actually a lot of evidence that economies are not in equilibrium. So what I want to suggest is that it was not the imbalance between theory and empirics. It was an attempt to shape the dialogue, the discussion in a particular direction, and the academic profession followed that for reasons that is really more a discussion of the sociology of academia than a question of anything else. And the apparent failures of macroeconomics is what has opened up the discussion. The point that was made is that it's not just inequality is something that was left out, it's actually something really essential to understanding what it is the nature of macroeconomics. Now, let me just make one more comment before I open it up for response. I'm not sure the theory of the firm is actually in as sound a state as people have said. This relates a little bit to behavioral economics. The fact is that we still don't have a good explanation of the dividend paradox. And as just one example of the behavior of the firm that cannot be reconciled with standard rational behavior. And this is a first order thing affecting how firms behave, and it has to be reflected when we think about what is the effect of taxation. So with those just remarks, let me turn to the panelists and just get the reaction to each other or to the remarks I've just made. Who wants to begin? Or Gabriel, do you want to say a few things?
No, I think John wanted to give some answers.
I mean, I'm happy to go first. Joe talked about ideology. I agree there's a lot of ideology in macro. I think there's a lot of ideology in lots of subfields of economics. I think ideology exists where facts are not convincing enough. Joe may be convinced about the facts. We all may be convinced about the facts, but unless we can convince the rest of the profession, the other side of the debate about the facts, then they are free to have all kinds of ideology. And so that's why I come back to thinking that this is really revolving around the facts. Let me come back to the minimum wage debate. I think it's unfair to talk about this as a problem in macro. This, the minimum wage debate is a labor debate. It's exactly the same thing. People were using perfect markets. Yeah, it's obvious that labor market's not perfect, but people were still, the debate was driven by perfect market logic for a long time, and that's in labor, not macro. And how did it change? It changed because we really raised the bar in terms of the facts. So Lucas and these guys, they weren't convinced about the facts. They attacked the facts. And it took us a long time to build new sets of facts that are harder for their sons and daughters, professionally speaking, to critique. And that's a process. It's a hard process. It's not something that is special to macro. It exists in earth science. It exists all over the place. We've stopped debating whether the earth is round. We went into space and took a photograph of the earth. And so, yeah, we've convinced everybody of that. But, barring that, it's hard to convince everybody of things.
No, I agree very much that Carlin Kruger had a really important influence in labor markets. But what about the simple fact that people of unemployment? You look at the statistics, going back, Josh talked about looking at numbers. There's unemployment. Now, it is true that people like Prescott interpreted the unemployment rates as saying that people are just voluntarily not working. But we've all long had the notion that if people are enjoying leisure, they're normally happy. They're not committing suicide, getting divorced, all the other symptoms of unhappiness. And that the reason unemployment is such a social problem is that because people are unhappy. So the question is, that seems to me a kind of fact that stares at you. And if you're willing to look away from that fact, it's going to be really hard to convince to build a good macroeconomics if you ignore facts like that stare you in the face. And the same thing about credit rationing. lots of micro evidence about credit rationing and equity rationing before economists were willing to incorporate that into their models.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, I think that it is, you know, really interesting to try and understand. This is a history. This is about the history of ideas and how ideas change in interaction with what's going on in the world. So, you know, you can go back one step further and ask the question of how did it happen that Keynesian macro took hold? And the explanation is that it was some interaction between problems happening in the world that rendered useless the previous prevailing paradigm and the availability of new theory that could explain persistent unemployment. So the new concept of aggregate demand, that was, you know, that was important. So, you know, the facts staring you in the face from the world combined with new and credible theory. So then you say, okay, well then what was it along those lines that produced the what was called at the time the new classical revolution? And so that was, you know, some intersection between the inflation problems at the end, you know, through the 1970s, the idea that that government had become the problem, was no longer the solution, and that there was this set of thinking, you know, sitting there in the wings that wasn't just macroeconomics. It was much more widespread view about the need to roll back government. And I guess the really interesting question is why in macroeconomics this took hold in such a deep way that became so embedded in this, what I think from the perspective of you know, someone really looking at this from a long way away would think of as being a really peculiar methodological turn to focus really obsessively on this one method of building these calibrated general equilibrium models and setting that up as the only valid activity that could be undertaken in macro. And that's what produced this turn away from facts that John's referring to. So, you know, there's a sociology of macro that, you know, there are some gaps there. And I think there are interesting questions about journals and the macroeconomists doing that kind of macro being not very useful in policy, so they could devote all of their attention to the journals and to kind of building the academic macro. So, but we're now in a different situation. I think we're in a really great situation because the problems are really pressing on us that just cannot be answered by that framework. And so, wow, this is the chance. Let's move the framework, integrating the new data and the new methods that have been pioneered in other fields. And we have, I think, a really great opportunity for making a constructive contribution.
Yeah. Anybody else want to say, go ahead. Gillian?
So,
go ahead. Josh.
Gillian can go first. I'll go after.
So I think, first of all, I would say, I think it's absolutely right that you get real changes in a field where there's a perceived failure, right? That we can think of what happened in the late 70s and early 80s and the turn towards theory as kind of the failures where, you know, potential output had been mismeasured and the, you know, people didn't understand shifts in the Phillips curve. And, you know, you can go through all of the historiography of, you know, why economists got a bunch of things wrong that together led to accelerating inflation. And so there was okay, we need a new theory, blah, blah, blah. I think the current empirical revolution kind of finally getting to macro from micro is really driven by the Great Recession, right? If we think about most of the really good advances in the field in the last decade or so, I think a lot of them, the questions and the motivation behind that work was the failure of circa 2008 macro to address those things. And I think the pandemic is probably going to push that even further, right? Because we have even more cases where we have to kind of abandon some of the frameworks we're used to and think about things. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about what I'm studying World War II a lot and what World War II has to say about pandemic in terms of like, what are the things driving household savings rates up by such a dramatic amount? And there's quite a lot actually to be said about the historical episodes tell you about what's going on now in terms of consumption restrictions, and we can kind of go back to that. But I actually want to defend Jón's argument that it's empirics that really is the answer to ideology. So, and I want to do it from the history of astronomy. So if we think about astronomy, before they had really good telescopes, they had all of these theories of like epicyclic motion, these very fancy theories to try to explain, how the sun could revolve around the earth. And the theories were just wrong, right? But the way they got past that and the way we got to modern astronomy was not by endlessly debating our theory, but by disciplining it with empirics. And that's what got us out of it. And I think the reason that many of us feel hopeful is really fundamentally that people took the Great Recession and hopefully are taking the pandemic to say, okay, we need to discipline our theory with more empirics and look at things empirically, figure out new facts. And that, okay, is it a problem if a significant fraction of the macro field is not interested in the empirical facts and is not engaging? Yes, that's not a problem I personally feel able to solve. That's a problem that those sectors of macro and the journals that do that kind of macro need to solve, and they need to change their value structure. But empirics is the way out. It's the way, more balance between empirics and theory is the way to discipline theory and push theory into more productive directions.
Thank you. Josh?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I want to reiterate the point that the political context cannot be ignored here. And there's no question that the shift that happened within macroeconomics coincided with a broader shift to the right in US politics and a shift in economic policy away from this sort of Keynesian vision. And those, whether or not today's practitioners of that style of macroeconomics have that sort of politics, I think you can't ignore that as the factor in that initial transformation. And I think also, even when you look at something like the new economics of the minimum wage, to make that work possible, there had to be minimum wages getting adopted. And to make that work interesting, it had to be a subject of discussion. So in that sense, also, you might say politics is actually leading the way. And incidentally, I'm sort of hopeful that maybe we'll see the same thing happen with rent control sometime in the near future. But I'm not convinced that empirics in the narrow sense is really what's decisive here. Incidentally, as I understand it, in the case of the astronomy, the Ptolemaic models with their epicycles were actually more accurate predictively than the early Copernican models. It took a while to get the Copernican thing up to the level of accuracy, but it was a more satisfying story without all those little wiggles. So I'm not sure that's really a direct story of better empirics. I think what makes the difference, it is engagement with economic reality, but not necessarily at the level that we think of as empirical work. The point, Joe, that you brought up, that if you have any sort of contact with unemployed people or just unemployment as a social phenomenon beyond this item in your model, it's obvious to you that this is not voluntary leisure. I think that sort of contact with the social reality that is the subject of economics outside of the framework of economics is what's really more decisive rather than empirical work per se. And I think what often wins the arguments within the profession, great empirical work definitely helps. And as I say, I agree with, I think, everybody else here that that's a more positive part of the macroeconomic field. But I think what is more decisive than that is narratives, it's stories, it's a compelling account of something that people are paying attention to. Obviously the account of what happened in the 70s and the failure as it was perceived of Keynesian demand management, I think made much more of a difference to the sort of adoption of the Lucas critique than probably anything else. And I think in the same way, a shift in macroeconomics going forward is going to depend on a compelling narrative and a compelling vision, perhaps more than specific empirical results. And it's also, coming back to the politics, it's going to depend on a political shift. I think one reason that I'm moderately optimistic about macroeconomics is I'm moderately optimistic about the direction of US politics. I think it's hard to imagine, the macroeconomic field changing if it weren't for a political context where it seems like the broader economics discussion was also shifting.
Well, thank you. We're almost out of time, or we are out of time. I want to make a couple of comments. One of them is the observation was made that it is much harder to incorporate in a broad model all the market imperfections than beginning with a perfect model and then introducing one friction or another, but keeping everything else the same. And we've been very critical of macroeconomics, but we should feel better as macroeconomics when we compare it to American climate economics, where the same problem has been done, where they've assumed that everything is perfect except for one thing, and that is the pricing of carbon. And the result of those models is that we should accept 3.5 degrees centigrade climate change, have the rest of the have us fry and take the risk, ignore the risk. So there, the consequence of that set of models is, I believe, disastrous for the world. Unfortunately, everybody outside the United States is not taking those models seriously. The broader point that has been made is that we have to adapt our models to the question that we are addressing. And if we don't do that adequately, we'll get misguided results. And I just want to mention one example of that. The reliance so much on monetary economics on the grounds that it doesn't distort the economy is a result in part of using highly aggregate models where there are not interest sensitive and non-interest sensitive sectors. If you use the interest rate as the mechanism of stabilization, then the burden of adjustment is put on interest sensitive sectors, and that distorts the economy. So I think we have to be aware that even when it comes to the issue of the balance between monetary and fiscal policy, if we use excessively aggregated models, we may actually get the question wrong. Gabriel, do you want to give any final comments?
No, I think we're out of time. And so I wanted to thank you all for a wonderfully insightful conversation. The recording of the event will be published on our website, econfip.org, in the coming days, where you can also find recordings of previous panels that we had over the last few months. So yes, thank you so much to all of you, and see you very soon.